This is Writer Circle number one. It's part of Carolus Press's podcast series. I'm Arthur Dane, here with Saxon Cross, Libertate, and Anti-Fragile Athlete, Louis Berrigan. Welcome. Today, we're going to get into the writing process, the crash course, how the writing process is different between writing narrative fiction, writing essays, writing poetry, so on and so forth. We'll discuss our current projects, our current ideas, try to organize them a bit better, more structured thought, and we will get into some of the more abstract ways that people sort of summon energy in which to write according. Why don't we start off with kind of going around and sharing some of the projects we're currently working on, or maybe not working on, but are forming in the corners of our minds. Andrew, why don't you go first?
Yeah. Hey, everybody, how's it going? So right now, my main writing projects are so I write on Substack. I try to publish there every week. That's a bit more of article writing. And then on the side, I am writing fiction. I don't publish that very often. I've published a few pieces there on Substack. I've kept that more private just because of the nature of writing fiction. It's a bit, you can't really crank it out the same way you crank out like articles. But I mean, that will be interesting to talk about the differences between the sort of creative process between the two. On top of that, I still do some Instagram writing occasionally. It's not something I'm particularly interested in right now, just because the 300-word format. For myself, I kind of hit my limit with that. I lost interest. I know some people are still really enjoying it, but yeah. So for me right now, Substack and fiction are my main projects.
Excellent. Neil Liberty.
So I'm pretty much just getting back into the flow of things in terms of writing on Instagram again. I don't think I'm quite ready to start posting again because, as Arthur was saying before we started this meeting, I'm a bit on the cringe side right now, but I'll get back there. But in terms of current projects, I've recently finished my EPQ essay, which I posted on Carolus Press about a month ago now, which I think was received quite well. And apart from that, I'm just writing stuff on the Donna Curie and my poetry page, and yeah, that's pretty much just it at the moment. But hopefully I'll get back into the swing of things.
Yeah, that was really cool to have a long piece from you on Carolus Press. That was a really good piece.
Yeah, if I stay behind next year, then I'll maybe have two more written up. Definitely one, but if I can get two cranked out, even better.
Excellent. Louis, anything you're working on?
I don't consider myself a traditional writer like you gentlemen, but mainly just exploratory idea generation, but writing music as well, but nothing like what you guys do.
Are you a songwriter or writing music in the sense of like a sheet music?
Neither. I mean, it's very rudimentary rap, but I work with some of my cousins and we sample music and do some singing as well. Blues guitar they play, and yeah, I just have fun with it. It's really enjoyable, but I would never want to release anything that is not like non-substantial like you hear with most music nowadays. So I'd really want it to have a purpose and actually be able to affect people in a positive way.
Very nice.
For sure, but you've definitely got to start out by posting things that aren't adequate, I'd say. Not your best work, so you just have to start somewhere.
I agree, definitely.
All right, good. Personally, I mean, writing has been kind of a hiatus for me. I've been more rooted in work with anti-fragile fitness, which is becoming a bit of a behemoth, while preparing for a tournament in Atlanta, actually, moved to Atlanta. So more physical and administrative work has sort of overtaken my creative efforts, which I think is good for the season. But I still have a lot of things sort of knocking at the back of my mind. My long-term projects, I've had a bunch of book ideas that I told Andrew about. I think maybe you should finish the three that you're thinking about right now. So that's probably for the best. there's a myth that I stopped writing a while ago that I feel, kind of scratching at my brain right now, titled "Drowning in Granite." It's a poetry collection that it looked like I was going to crank out pretty fast, but the day-to-day life that I had that was fueling the creation of that poetry collection kind of drastically shifted. So it's a different, and poetry is, the exception of free form is predominantly meter, and the rhythm of my life significantly changed. So I do think as I get into fight camp, that meter will start to return. So I might see poems come out from that again. I can finish A Fury Unrivaled. And then I have an ongoing, like, autobiographical Christian neo-noir called Sleepless. That I haven't posted a chapter on Substack for a while. But I'm hoping that I'll be able to put out chapter 5 tomorrow, titled "The War in the Soul." Other some odd writing projects. A bit about Pascha. Pascha was just this past weekend, although I had horrendous food poisoning that Andrew witnessed firsthand. Some Instagram writing, and I think what was the other thing? There's pieces of writing that I think are kind of tied to a most recent podcast that I did titled "Fitzgerald and False Gods" on YouTube. That has to do somewhat with like this common thread Nietzschean spirit that it's like this assailant to Germany and the United States, and so I have a kind of a long form piece that I think will be paired with that as well. Other articles on the horizon, one on the end of postmodernism and the other on anti-culture. So I have a lot of ideas all at once right now, and really not a lot of time to write it. So maybe we'll also get into kind of strategies for compartmentalized 15-minute periods of just extensive brain dumping before going into the editing process. So I see someone joined us by the name of iPhone. Who is it that has joined us?
Hello, Arthur.
I'm sorry, this is...
You can't tell by the accent.
Oh, hey, Brandon. Sorry.
Hey, what's up, buddy?
It ain't complicated, man. I go down over Rubik's Cube and this side. So yeah, that's so let's get into the different the different goals of fiction, nonfiction, articles, poetry, songwriting. I think maybe the most straightforward that I think most people can grasp is just narrative fiction. It's just common storytelling. Protagonist, whether it be a traditional protagonist or an anti-hero of sorts. That's I think what most of us has read, unless you're more of like someone who likes to consume instructional / self-help content or historical nonfiction or reference texts, things of that nature. Probably most of us have read narrative fiction of some sort in our lives. Andrew has an extensive grasp of Tolkien, other British canon, including poems like The Wanderer. I've heard him say that he goes back and forth on Paradise Lost. Obviously, he's leading a discussion on Beowulf. There's many different traditions of fiction. Some fiction will fall under what could be considered a canon. Can anyone give me a summation of what a canon is for a nation?
Did you say for a nation?
Yeah.
Yeah, so the canon of a nation would be essentially just a body of works that altogether encapsulate sort of the soul or ethos of that nation. So like you said, like a lot of the works you just brought up, those would go into like an English canon. That wouldn't be exhaustive, of course, that wouldn't cover all of it. But if you were talking about America, for instance, I think we talked about this on our podcast with Thomas and Nick, but you'd have works like, say, Mark Twain, that would be part of the American.
Absolutely, spot on. Yeah, and there's you can zoom out and you can zoom in accordingly depending on the specificity of a particular region of a nation or a region of Europe per se. When we speak about Western canon, this is canon that goes as far back as Homer, some odd pieces like Eurydice, the original Greco-Roman development of Europe. Um, Heading into the Christian influence over Europe, post Constantine or Constantine and onwards, um, and then obviously in the West you have developed canon that is sort of descended from the nations that emerged from the Holy Roman Empire influenced side of Europe, and in the East Byzantium, and later on Kiev and Rus turned Russia. Right, extensions of that include the United States, of course. So, and in some instances, this is somewhat of a debate that Andrew and I got into in the Anti-Fragile Fitness chat, is Spain's influence over Western canon, particularly Cervantes, particularly Don Quixote. So Don Quixote is like a foundational piece for pretty much the entirety of Latin American canon. Latin America is somewhat different compared to the rest of the north, the American West. And when I say the American part of the West, I mean the entire United States, not the Western frontier. That canon of Latin America has one foot in the Western canon, one foot out, because in North America you had a sort of intermarriage policy that was strictly within Anglo-Saxon heritage the first 100+ years of that nation. Later on, other European immigrants, whereas the Spanish marriage policy did intermarry with the natives of Mexico and further south, both Portugal and Spain. Portugal, of course, being limited to Brazil. So there's an extensive Western canon. I think you can firmly say within North America and Europe that begins with the Greeks and goes up until this point. You can zoom in further, country by country, right? So United States, France, Russia, England, Germany. I think one that sometimes flies under the radar is Norway. Norway has a pretty extensive canon. And you can even go by region. So, and this is a particular case of the United States. So there is a Southern American canon, right? There is a Southern Gothic canon that includes the likes of William Faulkner. The next podcast guest on Blood and Rain, and someone who I hope in the future will be involved with Carolus, is a man by name moniker Paul Fahrenheit, who's more of a dissident, more what's called DR. You can figure out what DR stands for the sake of our SEO. He's a DR contributor for Virginia. Now, within DR, there's a bunch of particularly Virginian people. So Virginia is obviously a part of the South, but to go even further in granularity, Virginia is the first state. It's the only Commonwealth in this country. They call it the Old Dominion. There's a deep adoration for Virginia and Massachusetts in particular when forming the class of the WASPs in the United States, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant class. That's a joining of the two original aristocratic classes of this nation, the Adams Circle, John Adams, and in Virginia, you have the likes of mainly Thomas Jefferson, George Washington to some extent, less so identified, more so identified with military prowess. Me personally, and I had this discussion with Paul Fahrenheit ahead of time. His wife is from Marin County, just north of San Francisco. You can go even further granularity with the United States. The Western frontier has a canon. Within California, at the center of our canon is John Steinbeck, a Nobel Prize winner in the 1950s, known for East of Eden, Cannery Row, The Grapes of Wrath. His works have become definitely a pillar of the American canon, but I'd say it's the centerpiece of California amongst people like Jack Kerouac, Jack London, very rugged works of the frontier spirit, and then the aftermath of settling the frontier with the sort of now what question. There is something that Paul Fahrenheit mentioned to a good friend of mine named Jay Burden, who he mentioned that it is catastrophic when a piece is entered into a canon that was never supposed to be there in the first place, right? For Europe, for the Western canon, this is the Communist Manifesto by obviously Karl Marx. That has been extracted from the Western canon since the late 1800s, and I think we're finally getting into an era where communism in every single form is being fully rejected from the psyche of the West. You're seeing this in what's emerging politically on sort of the fringes of ideas, the most cutting edge of ideas, people like Curtis Yarvin, academic agent, so on and so forth. But what we're seeing is this allowance of the communist ideal as a further extension of liberalism, 1 foot in liberalism and 1 foot out, that was catastrophic for the continuity of the West. The West was doing pretty well, and same thing with the East, for that matter. Until the Crimean War, it looked like Russia was going to overtake Istanbul and make it Constantinople again. So the East is quite in a healthy state. The West is quite in a healthy state until the Communist Manifesto was taken to heart. So that extraction will likely see the soul of the West, and for that matter, the soul of the East, these portions of your overall European diaspora thought be restored, thankfully.
The discussion of sort of a national canon or ethos, I think that's actually a really good topic for a first writer circle, because I think for any aspiring great writer, the first thing to do, it's not to work on your actual writing first. The first thing you have to do is to really immerse yourself in your own culture's canon. That's step one. Without that, if you just kind of write aimlessly without knowing sort of where you're coming from, you're not going to become a great writer in any one tradition or another. So like Arthur was saying, I mean, wherever it is you're from, if you want to participate in that canon, your number one job is to completely marinate yourself in that, learn everything you can about it. I've become convinced over the last year or so that the best writers aren't truly original, that the best writers are the ones that have been able to copy their forerunners the best. If that makes any sense.
I'd say for the most part, that's true. I think there are a few exceptions. Now, did anyone see the quote that Andrew placed for the ad about this writer circle and who it was by?
Sure, I'll post it on my story, but nah, can't say I remember it.
Okay.
No, then Ernest Hemingway.
Yeah. Did you want me to read that, Arthur?
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, this is Ernest Hemingway. Invention is the finest thing. You cannot invent anything that would not actually happen. That is what we are supposed to do when we are at our best. Make it all up, but make it up so truly that later it will happen that way.
Now, so when we speak about canon and we speak about continuity, it's funny. We speak about continuity like we need to continue the tradition, but the funny thing is, new eras of traditions are marked by some radical changes. It depends on how much the radical change is and that positive, right? Obviously, the Communist Manifesto was catastrophic. But this is actually, I'm probably going to do a really long stream on this in Blood and Rain. But can anyone guess as to the most catastrophic event in the West in the past 400 years?
There's a whole lot there, Arthur. A whole lot. You're asking very specifically.
Any guesses?
If I had to take a guess, communism, Communist Manifesto, Marx.
That's up there, right? That's sort of a prelude, but what this a single event, not a piece of thought. World War I, and it's not even close. World War I is the end of traditionalism in the West. It's the end of it marked the end of faith being the highest good in both the West and the East. Why is that? Well, you had Tsarist Russia. There were only two countries in Europe that weren't monarchies by the time World War One rolled around: France and Switzerland. That's it. Now, we know Switzerland has a long history. If you know the history of Switzerland, you'll know that it has a long history of being sort of like um, a joint effort of a country. That land was originally owned by four different factions. To this day, they speak four different languages: Italian, German, French, and Romansh. So they're like this neutral buffer state. So that doesn't quite count. France became a republic uh, during the Franco-Prussian War in the 1870s. Napoleon III was the last emperor of France. When it looked like, when the Germans had Paris surrounded and Napoleon III was captured, Napoleon III didn't want to give up Alsace and Lorraine to then and the Germans wanted to see the French monarchy restored because they want monarchy to continue to live as they were forming the German Empire by the hand of Kaiser Wilhelm of Prussia and Otto von Bismarck, its chancellor. The French Republic came to life in Paris to say, no, we're not going to surrender. We're going to continue to fight the Germans in its stead, right? The end of World War One saw this idea that maybe the things that we've centered Europe around all this time weren't the right ones. Started to question everything. Why? Because before, war had glory. Yes, someone lost, and someone lost a bit of land. And someone won, and they came home, and either I had this wonderful, glorious death on the battlefield for my nation, or I had this, I came home with victory, and now I'll start a family, and I have that part of my life behind me. In World War One, so many people are dying all at once of these stalemates for years, particularly in the Western Front. And it's the first mechanized war: airplanes, tanks, mustard gas, bombs, like all of these new forms of warfare where, wait a second, like maybe we should be questioning everything because war has changed. So maybe life has changed. And religion became considerably less important. And the new highest good was who is the best at the usage of resources for a people. This is obviously the case with the United States. This is obviously the case with Nazi Germany. Obviously the case with the Soviet Union. So World War One put an end to the traditional thought, and this shell shock had this idea: maybe we should have like a sort of a blank slate. Maybe we should forget about everything before us, and we should just write from scratch. Now, the person who really did this was Hemingway, right? Hemingway, if you visit his museum in Oak Park, Illinois, right next to Chicago, I went not too long ago. His goal as a writer: I just want to write one true sentence, right? That's a departure from any kind of canon in the past, right? That's not a continuation of the American canon. It's not even a continuation of the British canon. It's arguable that Hemingway can be considered American canon. He sort of carved something for himself, something else out for himself, because look at also the subject matter. He's not writing about anything particularly American. Short story, he's writing about his service in the ambulance corps in World War One in Italy, in short stories like In Another Country. His time in Cuba had him write Old Man in the Sea. His time in Spain had him write For Whom the Bell Tolls, about the Spanish Civil War. So he's not someone who's really a canon. He's just an author who came from a place. So we can say, oh, he's a great American author, but he's not really writing anything particularly American. He's writing something in a new style. Now, a lot of people kind of attribute Hemingway with this style of writing. He does have a precursor, though. There is a precedent to Hemingway. His name's Knut Hamsun. Knut Hamsun is a Norwegian man. He splashed into the scene with a book called Hunger that he wrote in 1899. It's somewhat autobiographical. And it's the first sort of stream of consciousness book. Now, we're starting to get into canon versus non-canon, traditional style versus from scratch, right? What is the benefit of writing in a traditional style in roots to where you come from? Well, you will most likely be revered over time by your people. That's quite a special thing, right? Fitzgerald, and I'm talking about this more and more, Fitzgerald is writing American stories. Gatsby might be the most important piece in the American canon because it describes the downfall of America in a false promise, just like Daisy was a false promise for Gatsby, right? That is distinctly American. Hemingway is sometimes known better than Fitzgerald as an American author, but he doesn't write anything particularly American, with a few exceptions in his short stories, right? So, however, he's better known. So you have this rootlessness to your writing if you decide to be someone who is from scratch. Your writing can go further places. Your writing can be read in China. Your writing can be read in Indonesia. It can be read in Colombia. And it'll be something that can be maybe digested a bit easier because you don't have to know the places that he's writing about as much, right? When you read what Andrew writes, it is distinctly two things. It's English, right, as an extension of the English canon, and it's Southern American. Why? Because Andrew is an Anglo-Southerner. Very simple. He has revered the canon of Tolkien. He has revered the canon of Beowulf, The Wanderer. He understands the canon of his people. Now, Andrew, correct me if I'm wrong. Have you been diving into Southern canon as much?
I did more so a few years ago. It's been a little while since I did. I read more when it comes to Southern American stuff. I've read more fiction than history books, honestly. Like you have series like you have the Killer Angels. I don't know if you've read that. You have a lot of these great Civil War novels that really capture that Southern American ethos that was so short-lived.
Mm. Have you read much like Southern Gothic, like Faulkner, Sound and the Fury, things like that?
I haven't read Faulkner, no.
Yeah, it's funny. So there's two pieces that I think are kind of appropriate to read, so I can start to differentiate. The generations of canons, and then the thought of separating oneself from canon and what one considered to be a pure frontier of writing. The first is a foreword for Paul Fahrenheit's what I just mentioned. He recently wrote a group of short stories centered around Virginia. He's trying to make a new mythos out of Virginia, particularly, maybe the entire South. His friend, who's another writer, who's another person I'm going to have in the podcast, who wrote a science fiction, dystopian science fiction novel called Automaton, he had this to say about in the foreword for Paul Fahrenheit's work. My gripe with the state of modern writing is that the stories they tell can take place anywhere. One of my writing mentors once told me, the specific describes the general, and I've tried to pass on that maxim to anyone who has ever sought my counsel or happened to be in my proximity for that matter. If James Joyce were a young writer today, there could be no Dubliners. Walk through any modern city and you'll pass a Starbucks, Verizon, Whole Foods, and then some token chain that exists in your locality, owned by an international conglomerate, like the Roman forts in Gaul. In-N-Out Burger is a colonizing force that brings the values and morals of California behind it. Every city gets to keep its outer facade of glitchy individuality, but underneath they're all the same, which makes writing about these places feel flat. Southern literature, and the South more generally, has been able to stave off the collectivizing force of modernity because it is always represented what the system is not. It is aristocratic, genteel, yet also dark and unsettling, and therefore unmarketable. One reads Faulkner and notes his characters would not look good on movie posters or selling insurance. My hopes and dreams for Paul in his writing were that when the last Southern Gothic author dies, it would be he who took up the mantle. His response was that the genre should die, so that something new could replace it. I thought about this conversation for a long time and tried to reconcile my desire to return with this vision of Renaissance. I believe that this collection of tales is that replacement. Paul writes Virginia itself as a character in his works, literally and figuratively. It is a conquered land, civilized by Europeans, and as Paul himself has said on many occasions, Virginia is a microcosm for the rest of the nation. The Old Dominion is a place, whether we are talking about the Tidewater, the Blue Ridge Mountains, the James River, or Appalachia. The stories you read in this work are Virginian. The heroes and villains have no context outside their home, and while they may echo older tales from faraway lands, these stories too only make sense in their time and place. Virgil wrote the Aeneid as a founding myth to unite the Romans. Tolkien attempted the same with his Lord of the Rings. I see Paul trying to do the same thing here. Whether or not he succeeds in the endeavor is not for me to say, not for any living person to say. But one day, in the far-flung future, if there is a young man sitting on the bank of the James with a fishing pole in one hand and a country squire's notebook in the other, there is no other barometer for success required. T.R. Hudson, a friend. Now, it's interesting. Paul Fahrenheit is trying to contribute to the Southern canon, particularly through Virginia, but he realizes that there is the Southern Gothic tradition that's been around since the late 1800s is dying, right? And that something needs to replace it. But it is still going to be the Southern canon. It's just going to be the next epoch, basically, right? There is no reason why Andrew wouldn't be capable of contributing to that, considering his heritage. You know, Alabama heritage dating back well to the Civil War. You know, grew up in Louisiana. There's no reason why he wouldn't be able to sustain that, right? There is no way that I could possibly contribute to the Southern canon. I've never been to the South. I will never fully understand the South like a Southerner. It's just not possible. I could contribute to the Californian canon if I so desire to be someone who paid homage to his land. Now, him and I would both have an equal bid to contribute to the canon of the United States. And maybe if we write a piece that not only transcends, the age of our respective, homelands of where we grew up, Louisiana and California, respectively, then it could go up to the United States. It could go up to the West, maybe. Will we? I don't know. Is there any reason why that couldn't happen? Not really.
Yeah, that's the thing. You can't. I don't think a writer, no matter how much they tried, if you don't have any sort of claim to the canon you're trying to contribute to, I don't think it's possible for you to really embody that. Like we joke about some of our friends on here. Like we joke about Letters from the Ruins. His writing is so British, but it's like
it's painfully British.
It's that way because it has to be. Like no one could fake writing that way. You can't fake a cultural heritage like that. So yeah, when it comes to these different canons of writing that we're talking about, it's up to people that are native to those to preserve them, because they can't, no matter how good of a writer you are, you can't preserve something like that isn't your own.
No, certainly not. No. And I'll give you an example. Some people might say, well, what if you're someone who was brought somewhere else and you become molded by that place? Well, you become something plus something. Now, a great example of this is anyone familiar with Pearl Buck? Anyone?
I'm not, no.
Pearl Buck is one of the few female Nobel Prize winners in literature. We joke like Wallman, very talented writer. Pearl Buck is an American woman who spent much of her life in China. So she's writing perspective on China from a European. There's no way she can pretend to be Chinese. She can understand Chinese dynamics from the outside, right? That is something plus something. For those of you who have read Dune, I can give you a fictional example. Paul Atreides did not come from Arrakis. Paul Atreides came from Caladan. So he became something plus something. Plain and simple. Now, Andrew joked a while back, I write a lot about New York too, because my father's from New York. My father grew up a New Yorker. He's like, I love reading your takes on America because it's so opposite from mine. Most of my takes, with a few exceptions, are rooted in cities, particularly San Francisco and New York. Now a little bit Chicago, that I've been living here a year, right? The common thread is America. He's writing about America from a much more rural standpoint. Now, let's say you don't want to contribute to a canon, right? There are some people who have like 1 foot in being a canonical writer and 1 foot being a blank slate writer. A really good example of this is Cormac McCarthy. he writes stories that take place in America, but it's not really something that you can fully accept as American canon. You can't put Blood Meridian fully as American canon. You can't put No Country for Old Men as American canon. Some stories too that kind of deal with being 1 foot in, 1 foot out of the border kind of deal with this too. If you've read the other novellas that are in the collection of Legends of the Fall, particularly Revenge, the first one, it's talking about like this Tejano culture, like Texas and Mexico, right? So it's like, it's a bit more rootless. So let me give you an example of what it means to be of the thought of a blank slate writer, and who I think the person who has done this best has been Ernest Hemingway, right? This is a name you hear everywhere. You hear this in every single country. It's not just that he was good looking when he was young. It's not just that he was this larger than life character, boxed and sailed and had a cigar in his mouth at all times. Like he really was blank slate in every sense of the word. He was writing things that he understood. He was writing things that he experienced, right? But at the same time, there's no canonical roots in this whatsoever. So this is actually something that I read as the piece for the first piece for the Nobel Prize reading challenge of podcasts that has been in the making for a year now, because I haven't released any other episodes.
Yeah, that's something we should bring on to Carolus Press. That'd be a really good thing to feature here.
Actually, yeah, I think that's a better fit for Carolus, considering all the other things I have to deal with between fighting and anti-fragile fitness, expanding that. It's just
while you're pulling that up, I'll ask, because Brandon and Caleb joined us late. Are you two working on any writing projects right now?
Not really. I mean, I have one idea that I kind of started writing, like an article idea for Carolus Press, but not really. I mean, I've done a couple of English assignments. Actually, I did one on Tolkien just the other day. I had to turn it in, but that's my last one I have to do for school. But I have been thinking about my writing for Carolus. I have an idea that I want to get out there.
Okay, yeah, great.
Unironically, assignments for college, even though they feel a bit not fake, but they don't feel legitimate in a way. My EPQ, that was only prompted because of college. I think if you've got a good piece that you've written for school, definitely submit it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've actually turned school writing into articles I've posted before. It's actually a pretty good place to start.
I would agree. So I'm just everyone and Brandon, are you writing anything?
Brandon? Hello?
Yeah, sorry guys. I'm at work right now. I'm in the middle of doing something, but yeah, I'm currently funnily enough, Andrew, your Substack article on country music and its roots has driven me to pick up my pen and start writing country music again. So I'm currently in the middle of writing 2 songs. A buddy of mine here actually produced music. So me and him are working together to put some music out and do some independent stuff together. So that's currently what I'm working on.
Okay, yeah, that's great, man. I'm glad that article got you going on that.
Yeah, that's something that I have like zero experience with, is like songwriting, for Lewis and Brandon. So I can only like, we could probably do some like lyrical analysis at some point. Maybe in the future. So that might be an interesting route to go down, because Dixie is a part of the South as the Sound and the Fury is.
Yeah,
Maybe probably
songwriting
more,
is-
honestly.
Yeah, songwriting is hard because you have to capture something in such a small number of words. Then you have a chorus that repeats, so it's even less words really. So it's really difficult to get that right.
The thing is with songwriting, it's not so much what you're saying, it's the way in which you're saying it. because obviously, like you just said, Andrew, you have so many few words to actually write in terms of maybe a 2 or 3 minute song. But I'm not gonna show you guys here, but I've tried turning some of my own poems into songs, and as long as you have a beat and a rhythm and the words flow, it's more in which the way that you say it rather than what the words are saying.
Yeah. All right. Carrying on back to um, kind of canonical writing and blank slate writing. This is the Nobel Prize acceptance speech from Ernest Hemingway in 1954, and I think this pretty much captures his belief of writing. Having no facility for speech making, and no command of oratory, nor any domination of rhetoric, I wish to thank the administrators and the generosity of Albert Nobel for this prize. No writer who knows the great writers who did not receive the prize can accept it other than with humility. There is no need to list these writers. Everyone here may make his own list according to his knowledge and his conscience. It would be impossible for me to ask the ambassador of my country to read a speech in which a writer said all the things which are in his heart. Things may not be immediately discernible in what a man writes, and in this sometimes he is fortunate. But eventually they are quite clear, and by these and the degree of alchemy that he possesses, he will endure or be forgotten. Writing, at its best, is a lonely life. Organizations for writers palliate the writer's loneliness, but I doubt if they improve his writing. He grows in public stature as he sheds his loneliness, and often his work deteriorates. For he does his work alone, and if he is a good enough writer, he must face eternity, or the lack of it, each day. For a true writer, each book should be a new beginning, where he tries again for something that is beyond attainment. He should always try for something that has never been done, or that others have tried and failed. Then sometimes, with great luck, he will succeed. How simple the writing of literature would be if it were only necessary to write in another way what has been well written. It is because we have had such great writers in the past that a writer is driven far out past where he can go, out to where no one can help him. I have spoken too long for a writer. A writer should write what he has to say, and not speak it. Again, I thank you. Now, I get chills every time I read that speech, for more reasons than one. There's subtext there too, in between what he's saying, in between the lines themselves. You almost feel like this chilling thing that cuts to the bone, where you kind of realize that Hemingway is a man completely alone in the world. 4 different marriages. I mean, yeah, you can see the life around him, but he really is saying who he is. There's no one around me who can really help me say what it is that I need to say. No one. It is me and me alone. Now, he said something there too about writing alone is a lonely profession. I actually agree with that. Right? You can prospect new material by interacting with others. You know, Hemingway was a very social guy. So that might be something that a lot of people would misconstrue. It's like, well, what do you mean? You know, he was always out partying. When he's speaking about writing deteriorating, I think he was actually talking about particularly F. Scott Fitzgerald. The more F. Scott Fitzgerald got more popular, his writing started to deteriorate towards the end. His best books are at the very beginning of his career. This Side of Paradise, 1920, The Beautiful and Damned, 1922, Gatsby, 1925. Beyond that, I don't really hear much about Fitzgerald. Hemingway almost peaked at the end of his career before suicide with The Old Man and the Sea. Some would argue, For Whom the Bell Tolls. People, Hemingway autists like me would argue his short stories, which a lot of scholars agree with. But can you see the difference? Like he doesn't really believe. He doesn't think of like a continuity in the sense there is a common thread here. Of he's saying other people have gone further out into the proverbial frontier, right? This isn't no longer a canonical frontier. This is beyond canon. For canon, it's the next step. I have my country behind me. I have my state behind me. I have my land behind me. I have a people behind me. Hemingway's saying, I have humanity behind me, but no one really cares because no one is invested in what I'm doing. I just need to find something else in that frontier. I am completely alone where no one can help me.
Well, I
In
think
some
that
ways,
also
that is
brings up the point that we've reached a point in Western culture where there may very well be plenty of people that feel zero connection to any older canon, to any traditional canon. And so if they happen to be an aspiring writer, they may not feel like they have any desire or duty or interest in anything older. Like they may feel like that, and just that they have sort of this general idea of, humanity behind them, but they have no greater culture that they're writing for.
absolutely.
I think Hemingway was on the forefront of exactly that, Andrew. He's the beginnings of that isolated, non-canonical culture of writing that really stems from not being rooted in culture itself. I mean, he traveled around a lot. He traveled the whole world. I mean, he was an ambulance driver in war zones. He's been around, but I think from that, maybe disconnected from his own culture a bit. And that was the foundation for his writing, which a lot of modern writers have stemmed from.
Yeah, yeah. It's both beautiful and it's harrowing at the same time because he's dealing with a truth that not a lot of people want to deal with.
I thought that I actually hadn't heard that speech before, but I haven't read a ton of Hemingway besides The Old Man and the Sea, but I do love that book. But it's interesting to think about his philosophy, how alone he felt, and how I feel like that's so reflected in the story Old Man and the Sea. I feel like the story is just it's one man versus like almost himself out there versus nature. It's a very like lonely feeling story, and I feel like it reflects his that speech very well.
Honestly, Hemingway lives in my psyche probably more than any other writer. And honestly, it's not even that I want him to. Like, there's a lot of guys who like, there's a lot of like, Hemingway is literally me autists out there. Like that, those are real. Like, um, uh, and hang on a second, guys. Sorry about that. A bit of a crisis going on apparently. But for when I have this thing burnt into my mind when I was, when I was 15, right? So this is a bit more of a personal note, but I'm saying this for good reason. When I was 15, I was starting my sophomore year of high school, and I came off of a summer of quite a bit of tragedy. I found out someone who is near and dear to my heart, someone I had feelings for, had committed suicide. So I had this first period English class, first class of sophomore year. I had this English teacher who was kind of like he's from Buffalo, I think, originally. He's kind of a tough older man, right? Bit grumpy, bit mean. But he really captured just like, I need you to bleed. Like, I need you to bleed at the paper right now. That's all I need you to do. That's all I'm asking. And I had quite a bit to bleed after that summer. And reading and that to me, before that, I wasn't a writer. I had nothing to say before. English class, like, oh yeah, I wrote a young authors project about like this Roman soldier and he's banished and then he went to China to raise an army to get revenge on Rome. Like, really just cringe. Like, it's a fucking sixth grader story. I had nothing authentic to say. I had no depth until that summer of the tragedy, and he was right there, right on cue to help harness that. And when we went over the writers of the time, the only of the writers that really stuck out to me when we were doing, the typical sort of, going through the eras of American literature, right? Colonial literature, right? Then you go in, starting around the 1840s, Romanticism runs parallel to Transcendentalism. Transcendentalism being the like of Henry David Thoreau, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Bronson Alcott, Louisa May Alcott, so on and so forth. Henry David Thoreau was one that pretty heavily lived in my psyche personally, because I found this out about this person while I was on a Boy Scout summer camp, right? And nature, Andrew likes to make this joke. I'm such a city slicker. I actually, I've lived in extremes my entire life of city slicking and wilderness, right? So wilderness was a big thing for me. So he's someone I related to immensely, was Thoreau. And then the other two were Fitzgerald, because I just found the anguish and the longing of Fitzgerald so relatable. But the main thing was Hemingway. It's just like, I have things to bleed. I'm alone. I'm an outcast in a high school where I was supposed to be a quarterback. I am an only child. I'm probably going to be a divorced kid. I am the first generation of my family here in America. I'm seeing far more depth in life than most are around me. None of you can help me. None of you. I am completely alone in the world, and that's just the reality. So I had this sort of separation that kind of that came from Hemingway. Hemingway is the best person for me to read in a lot of ways because of that. So that's the difference between Blank Slate. When you have something that can't really be fully in line with canon, you just best bleed as best as you can. Now, there's something else entirely where you can make a completely new mythos, right? A perfect example of this is Frank Herbert. Islamo-Buddhism is a religion in the canon of Frank Herbert's Dune series. There's quite a few books in the Dune series, right? You can make a mythos from scratch. Now, take the differences between George R.R. Martin and J.R. Tolkien. Tolkien is trying to make a mythos within England/Europe, right? The Shire, Doggerland, that's pretty much England, old Rome's Gondor, or Byzantine Empire's Gondor, right? So it's both English and Western canon. George R.R. Martin was making something from scratch, and as cringe as he is, he made a pretty phenomenal mythos. Like I've studied it in depth between the H.P. Lovecraft influences, amongst others. H.P. Lovecraft is somewhat American canonically because he wrote with the characters starting in America, but he was writing a Cthulhu mythos, right? So obviously we don't know of any sea monsters at Point Nemo in the Southern Pacific, right? This isn't something that we grew up with historically. So that is something completely from scratch. Now, the myth that I am writing currently, there were things that I just sort of idea muscled this, and now we're sort of getting into, and the reason I came from the canonical end versus the blank slate end is to get into the creative process of writing itself, what you want to write when it comes to fiction, right? You have canonical and you have non-canonical, blank slate.
I
The
think there's an interesting
non-canonical,
point to make there where, at least from what I've seen, I'd have to think on this more, but it seems that writers that try to participate in a canon compared to those who don't, like Hemingway or Lovecraft, they seem a lot less tortured. They seem a lot more stable, a lot happier, a lot just more optimistic in life. Whereas these guys that try to write on their own outside of any sort of canon, I think that's where you really get that sort of tortured artist archetype from.
agreed. Honestly, agreed. Like, what emerged for me canonically was California, right? I kind of came to this realization in the year that I left, like up to me leaving, like specifically San Francisco. Like San Francisco raised me in every sense of the word, and it is part of my being. I grew up there. San Francisco was settled by the Spanish. My dad's a full-blooded Canary Islander, but who owns the Canary Islands? Spain. My mother is Italian and French Basque. The Italians and the French Basque have owned North Beach for 130 years. I'm a Muay Thai fighter. It's the birthplace of American Muay Thai. I'm Orthodox. It's a birthplace of American Orthodoxy. I know the land. I feel the soul of the land from Healdsburg all the way to Salinas, where John Steinbeck writes about. I am California. I'm in Chicago now. I love Chicago. Even in New York, where my father's from, I felt like a fish out of water because I'm a Californian. I'm a San Franciscan. After being a Christian, being a son, and soon a husband and father, after all that, I'm a San Franciscan Californian first and foremost. I feel a lot happier, right? Right. I feel a lot more peace writing about that. Everything else I write just seems to be very blood and rain, honestly. And so you have to ask yourself, like, how rooted are you to where you're from? If you're not, you got one of two options. You can write something completely from scratch. It's painful. You will bleed. That's why Hemingway constantly talked about just bleed at the typewriter. He wasn't having a very good time. Or you can be someone who is outlandishly creative and making a mythos, right? Those people too, I don't think, well, George R. R. Martin's a bit of a, he's just a miserable fucking sack, isn't he? But I don't think that Frank Herbert was someone who's particularly miserable. I don't think a lot of science fiction writers like Orson Scott Card or Arthur C. Clarke are particularly miserable either, right? So I would say, it doesn't have to be like that, but oftentimes it is. And to give you an example too, right? The three things that I'm writing, and one's poetry. We'll discuss poetry in a different writer circle because that's a whole other thing, right? I'm writing Sleepless, which is autobiographical, right? So we can knock that out too, right? The main thing I'm working on is Drowning in Granite. That's a myth. I made this myth from an idea muscle exercise, and I just tried to write something like truly authentic. So I was bleeding, but when I zoomed out, I saw influences that I didn't realize that were there. Right? There's an Exodus influence, so a biblical influence, right? The Bible is a part of Western canon. That's a whole other discussion as well. There is influences of Rome. There's influences of Byzantium. There's influences of actually Lockean blank slate theory in there. So it wasn't as original as I thought, although I was writing as expressively as I possibly could. So getting into the writing process for fiction, how do you put pen to paper, right? How do you get to that point? Well, there's a number of ways you can go about it. Like, what is it that you particularly want to write? Do you even know? If you don't, is that a problem? Not really, actually. It just isn't. The reason I'm writing a myth now is because when I was in 5th grade, there was a young authors project at my highly difficult academic elementary school, and they gave you a bunch of different genres, that you could write, to choose from. I saw myth. I was like, oh, that looks very cool. And I saw the description, and me at 10, I made the decision like, I don't think I'm ready to write that yet. And I wasn't. So I wrote some silly little adventure thing that my teacher ripped to shreds. And not literally, just, figuratively. And so I knew I wanted to write a myth at this point, a new mythos, right? Something that could reflect the era that the world is in, but it's in a completely different place that no one's ever heard of before. You could want to write something like that. You could want to write something else. You could not know. What do you do if you don't know? Well, what are you particularly feeling like at the time? Right? Some people are in a particular stage in life, right? They could be in a particular stage of isolation. You could be in a stage of inspiration for a season. You could be inspired by the place around you, whether that be a place where you're from or not, right? There's a number of ways you can draw from. A bunch of places you can draw from of what you would want to write. You could take inspiration from the books you're reading too, right? So there was once upon a time a thing called Blood and Rain books, right? That I tried doing while I was deeply sleep deprived. Didn't work. For some reason I did a poll. I was like, what do you guys want to read? When really I just wanted to write a psychological thriller. And then everyone was like, we want a Greek myth. And that was actually the fucking last thing that I wanted to write. So I put out a chapter of it called Koios and Kythera. So it's like a Greek myth about this Spartan far from Sparta who found himself in the Peloponnese, right? And Kythera in particular, a very peculiar isle of the Peloponnese. I wrote the first chapter of it. It wasn't bad. I was too sleep deprived, and then I actually outlined the entire thing. It was so sleep deprived, I completely forgot it and misplaced the note, and I don't even remember what it was that I wrote. Like, that's where my brain was at the time. So I didn't even particularly want to write that, but I was able to follow through with it, right? Andrew, you want to jump in here like quickly, like, what are some of the places that you draw inspiration of, like the first decision of what you were going to write in the first place?
So for writing fiction, I think the best thing you could possibly do is just read more. Like if you're feeling writer's block, you just need to read more. That's whenever all the best writing I've done in that realm has all been because I was reading something recently, or I read a whole series of related works recently. I think it's really hard to get into the right headspace for writing fiction if you aren't consistently reading to just produce that on your own. And I think some people, especially now, have this idea that taking too much inspiration from what they're reading is a bad thing, that they need to be more original. I would say the opposite is true. You should be reading as much as you can, taking as much inspiration as you can, and using the parts that stick out to you as much as you possibly can. For writing articles, it's a totally different mindset.
Let's just stick for fiction. I wanted to do everything today, and obviously we do not have the time. So let's just stick with fiction for this first one.
Yeah, for fiction, I try to, whatever I'm reading, if it stuck out to me, I tried, instead of trying to be more original, I'll instead do the opposite and try to really embrace whatever it is that's been on my mind that I've been reading about that has like spoken to me, and I'll try to write something akin to that.
Yeah, I think you can read too much, but I think reading is always a net positive for inspiration. You should also be living too, right? It's funny, like I talked about, the poetry inspiration I was came from living, right? I was getting ideas in the middle of sparring, like, oh, that's a great idea, right? And I need to now dodge a head kick, right? So just moving around, being in your body, experiencing the world around you, there's inspiration there. And if there isn't, you're doing something wrong in life. I mean, I've said before, it's funny, Andrew was just here in Chicago. If we were we decided to pull an all-nighter the first night, naturally. We're driving around the city of Chicago at night, which is why, Andrew is now literally Ryan Gosling. It's literally him. And he said to me, Chicago, interesting, this is a good Blood and Rain side story. And that really took me aback. And I was just like, I suppose it is, right? Canonically, I should be in San Francisco. I should be dwelling where I'm from, right? But, there is a lot of inspiration to take from this place, from its architecture, from its history, from its peculiar essence. So living and reading, I think, are the two sources of inspiration that are quite literally endless, especially from the metrics of what we're capable of in a single lifetime. Now, someone taught me something a good 3 years ago now. Stretching the idea muscle. The idea muscle is something that you can stress. You can work it out. Follow anti-fragile fitness for idea muscle protocols. It's very simple. You write 10 ideas. 8 of them will probably be terrible. 2 of them will be good. So what do you do with those 2 good ones? You write 10 details about those ideas. Let's say one of those ideas was good. You write 10 details about that idea. Then write 10 details about each of those 10 details. Then you have 100 ideas worth. So there you go. You're welcome. That will help you flesh out a story.
Actually, try. Yeah, that sounds like a pretty good exercise.
Yeah, I mean, you could do that with plot points. You could do that with characters. There's actually a good thing that George R. R. Martin said. It's just Game of Thrones is just so fucking cringe. Like, that's the problem. Like, he wrote this great mythos for it all to be like, nothing means anything, and like, subvert your expectations, bullshit. Maybe we can do we can do a whole other, episode on why that's cringe. I mean, it's been about 4 years since, the show just completely fell on its ass. But he said there are 2 types of writers when it comes to, writing fiction, in particular, like fantasy fiction. You have architects and gardeners, right? So he styles himself more a gardener. His characters surprise him as he goes on writing, right? Some people are kind of a hybrid of both. What does that mean? I know this character needs to get from A to B. This protagonist needs to have this transformation from point A to point B. What we may not know is how he gets there, right? Maybe we try idea muscling it there. I'm like, no, I need to write chapter by chapter, and I'll figure it out as I go, right? And then that begs the question of sentence structure, right? Now, sentence structure is more of a grammatical thing. A sentence needs a subject, needs a verb. That's really it. Andrew eats. That's a sentence. The end. It's not a particularly interesting sentence, but it's still a sentence. Now let's have an object of the verb. Andrew eats food. Okay, now we're getting somewhere. Andrew eats. What did we eat this past podcast? Andrew smokes cigars, right? Oh, okay, he's smoking now. Interesting. All right, he's smoking a cigar. Good choice. It's supposed to have vape. That'd be cringe. Andrew is smoking cigars under the overhang of the Orthodox Church in Chicago. Oh, interesting. That's where he's smoking. And I haven't heard too many people smoke next to a church. I wonder what that's about. Wow, suddenly your sentences are getting more interesting, right? Now, going back to Hemingway, he had a particular way of writing where he wanted every single word to hit as hard as possible. So he was particularly averse to the adverb, right? What's the adverb? Words ending in ly, they will describe verbs. They will also describe adjectives, right? He was stupendously boring, right? No, boring isn't hitting hard enough if you need to say stupendously. Well, that's actually not quite it. Like we could say dull, or we could say droning. He was a droning person, right? It's better than a boring person. There are plenty of boring persons, and then that's a boring sentence. He was a droning person. Am I particularly averse to adverbs? Not really. I was just on Will Spencer's podcast talking about differences between Fitzgerald and Hemingway. Fitzgerald wasn't a minimalist like Hemingway. Fitzgerald would use as many words as he needs to sort of paint. Right now, we're getting into the subtle nuances of sentence structure. We're creating more of an essence with our writing. What's the essence of Hemingway? Hard hitting every single time. It's undeniable. Like, he is saying what he means. There is no mincing words. He is creating an essence as raw as possible. Fitzgerald's creating something more openly fantastical. It's this prose dripping off the page. Why is it dripping off the page? He's talking about extravagance. He's talking about decadent America. He's talking about the Hamptons. He's talking about old New York. He's talking about the American dream. Notice the difference in essence between the two things I just said. One's fluttering, flowing, beautiful. The other one's hard, undeniable. It's like a crowbar to the jaw.
Yeah, it's interesting to see how these styles, even with people we know in these circles that, we're not professional writers, we're beginners, you can see those different styles and those different ethoses like already kind of coming out different people. Like some people are just already writing one way. Like we always talk about our friend Chase.
Yeah.
Like people have a certain ethos in them that's going to come out when they write that they didn't necessarily choose.
Yeah, I mean, Chase can only write like Chase, right? Thank God. For those of you who follow Chase closely, he's very up and down, right? I'm not gonna imitate Chase for this recording, but I'm going to take a hiatus for 6 months, and the next day he's written 5 posts. He's written 5 poems.
He loves to reverse psychology himself.
Chase is Irish, right? In the Celtic traditions of writing, there's something in the Celtic blood that is very up and down, right? So you go to Ireland, right? They're sort of like you sort of confront them in normal plain speech. Chase's last name is McBride, so he has like a heritage, a blood heritage of Celtic tradition. It's funny, he writes these brilliant things, and you try to ask him about it in person. He's like, oh, I don't know. Like, what do you mean you don't know? He's like, well, maybe, I had, nah, never mind. Like, but then he'll take pen to paper and it'll just be the most like fantastical, outlandish thing that's just deeply alluring, right? He's not going to write like an Englishman. It's just not possible for him. He could. It's not in his blood. I can't write like an Englishman. The only thing I share in common with English writing is a certain level of somber nature, because everything English has some kind of like somber painted to it. Even Lord of the Rings, Scouring of the Shire, somber. The Wanderer, somber. Beowulf, somber. Oh, look how Beowulf ends, somber. Paradise Lost, somber.
Yeah, that was
Everything.
interesting when we talked about on the podcast we did together how like no matter how far back into English writing you go, you'll never find a time when it wasn't that way. Like it was always somber, even from the earliest conception.
Even if it's like the height of the empire, like the Victorian era, that's also its downfall. Somber.
Yeah.
Like it's hilarious. What does it differ from France? Gosh, dude, I've made this joke 1,000 times, and I'm going to make it again. French people, you meet them, particularly the particularly more godless French, right? Parisian. They wake up in the morning, they have joie de vivre, joy of life, right? It's daytime. Oh, it's just these beautiful things I see in my life every day. Oh, it's just so wonderful. I don't need much to make me happy. It's just so beautiful. And then later in the day, after some absinthe and some wine, like I just don't know anymore. These things that hold in this beauty no longer means the same. I don't know where to go from here. It's this constant existential crisis. It's like stupendous grandeur, and then it all comes crashing down. They cannot be consistent to save their lives. The only bit of consistency they've ever had was Napoleon, in the fact that he didn't want buildings to go above a certain height. Right? That's the only real consistency in French culture. Even the way that France is organized, like there's so many subcultures in France that you'd be actually shocked how different they are, despite being under the umbrella of being French. No one can write with more anguish than the Russians. No one has been through more than the Russians, right? It's not close. They write with a particular intensity that I think is unmatched, except for maybe the Spanish. Spanish are very intense in the way that they write. They're almost like a portmanteau of the Russians and the English in that way. Why the English? Spanish can be very somber. It's just like very melancholic. My dad can get that way sometimes. Like, oh, stop! Like, just please stop. Right? I think that's maybe the shared somber thread that we have in English. But the Spanish are also incredibly intense. There's a lot of fire there. Like El Cid, right? If you read the play Life is a Dream by Calderon, very intense. Polish literature, and I only know this because I've read Czesław Miłosz, some of The Witcher, and my girlfriend's Polish. It's almost like spooky. Like there's this spooky and very intense nature to it, right? And these essences can be portrayed in the way that you are telling a story, the way a story goes, and it can be under the hood of every single sentence that you're writing, word choice, flow, amount of words in a sentence. And how do you answer all these questions when you're writing? Who are you? Are you going to reject who that is when you write, or are you going to embrace who that is? Do you not know who you are? Are you trying to find out with your writing? Then I suggest you bleed. Do you want to write things more flowing or more concise and more hard-hitting? Are you canonical or not? Do you want to make a mythos or not? So many different factors. Are you honoring your blood? Are you just writing with your blood? Some people can write outside their blood. They're able to mimic accordingly until it becomes something authentic. I don't think Chase is one of those people. Chase again has that Celtic existential crisis of all time. Garbage, greater myth. And Andrew and I talk about this a lot. We think, me personally, I believe this as well. Garbage and Chase, I think, are two of the most authentic writers we've ever come across, and I think they have the potential to be like generational. Garbage has a heritage that's foreign to most. He's a Sikh from Punjab, northern India, and I won't imitate him either, his actual voice for this recording. But he talks about, I've noticed that I have a habit of writing of people who have hope and then lose the hope and then find hope again. Right? There's a particular heat in what he's writing. You can almost like, if you've seen pictures of Punjab, you've seen the foothills of the Himalayas, you'll start to understand his writing more. You understand the warrior traditions of the Sikh religion that he comes from, you'll understand it more.
Yeah, I've enjoyed having him on. I think we've posted like 3 different things from him so far on Carolus Press, and I fully expect to publish full books from both of them at some point.
Yeah, they're brilliant. They're 2 of the best writers that I know. So yeah, we're coming up, sort of the last 8 minutes. I'm at literally in the parking lot outside church. I have a visual. But any questions, concerns? Well, not really concerns, just questions or statements, guys.
Not for me. I think we covered sort of the core of canonical writing pretty well. I think it's going to be really good to share to this. I'm looking forward to seeing really how many people that are, joining the Carolus Press club and community we have here. How many of them are going to become good writers through it? How many will be able to publish in the future? I'm excited for that.
Yeah, y'all are inspiring me to get writing. I feel like I haven't been really thinking about that, but it'd be fun to try to do something.
Yeah, and this is kind of, if you're gonna travel, guys, I don't really think too many people who would follow us would act this way. Everyone in this one's American, right? We have no Brits. Oh no, Neo, right? So this is also something that that Brits have a habit of doing sometimes too. Don't live the American or British experience in another country.
Explain.
A lot of people hear me talk about like essence, right? Like when I got to Chicago, I was really fascinated with Chicago because I couldn't really understand it. I couldn't grasp its essence. What is an essence? It's like it's the core of its being. It's not just the attributes, it's not just the history, it's not just the people, it's not just the customs. It's the core. And this is something that I learned in drama school when we were fleshing out characters. We had all these in the 3 terms of my first year of drama school. We had, characteristics, we had actions, we had all these tools, lobbing and all this. And I was just like, but at the core, what is the essence of this character? That's the real question that matters as an actor. And that's the real question that matters as a writer as well. When I got to Chicago, I was really confused because I could not grasp the essence to save my life. I was like, what the fuck is this place? Like, this makes no sense. I'm standing in the middle of a fountain, not in the middle of a fountain, but a plaza with a fountain. I feel like I'm in Paris right now. I look dead ahead to the Congress Hotel. That reminds me of Ghirardelli Square in San Francisco, and it has that same essence. I turn to my right and I see these skyscrapers at the edge of Grant Park or Millennium Park. That feels like Central Park West in New York City. And I turn around and I have this freshwater lake that's eerie. Like, where the fuck am I? And I go neighborhood to neighborhood. It feels like a completely different place. I don't know if you felt a similar thing, Andrew, but when we went from neighborhood to neighborhood, there was little common thread between each of them. So what does that tell me? Well, that in some ways this city was made against its will. Like, this city was willed here. It wasn't very organic. Why was a city put here in the middle of the plains, the middle of fucking nowhere? Because there's a huge lake. There's a huge lake that's a third coast for America, for trade. If it wasn't for that, this place wouldn't be here. That's why it's kind of always at war with itself, because it wasn't really meant to be made. There's nothing organic that really came from here. And when you go to a museum in Chicago, I went to a museum in Chicago, I'm like, this, like, even its history's weird. Like, just no one can really hold on to anything here in Chicago. I've struggled. I've even struggled with it in my faith. The cathedral in San Francisco is like almost what's like keeping San Francisco from what's like being cast straight into the Pacific Ocean by the hand of God, like Sodom and Gomorrah. And in some instances, same thing with the cathedral I go to here now in Chicago. Me not being able to fully grasp Chicago at first had me get that there are common threads of, with Gotham City, what makes up the essence of what could be called Gotham between New York City and Chicago. It's that old Gilded Age somewhat Nietzschean spirit that came across the water. So when you travel, guys, right? when you're interacting with a new place, that may be an opportunity. If you're a canonical writer of where you're from, that may be an opportunity to be able to write something else briefly. That's a valuable opportunity. And knowing another place will actually help you understand your home even better too, because you know what your home is not. So don't like be in a little bubble of Americanism when you go to a foreign place, or Angloism for that matter. Sorry, headphones crapped out. Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, you're good.
Let's see if I can be on speaker. Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Yep.
If you go to Egypt, live Egypt. If you go to France, live France.
So what do you mean?
You'll
Because
understand a
obviously
lot
you
more.
can't exactly replicate their cultures, but so what? Try and just immerse yourself in them, or
Yeah, have an understanding. Like I said before, Pearl Buck will never fully understand China, but she wrote a lot about China that was very compelling from a different perspective. Any other
Yeah.
questions, guys?
No, I mean, I think that might be a good place to wrap it up.
I got a quick question.
Yeah.
Yeah, shoot.
Do you recommend that people pick either canon or blank slate and then stick to it, or does anyone switch back and forth?
I'm probably going to be doing both because of California.
Okay. Just curious about that.
Yeah, no, you're not damned to be one or the other. Like there are Nobel Prize winners too who are known for like their poems, their novels, and their plays. You know, so. All right, guys. It's the church bells. I got to get going.
Oh yeah.
All right,
Thanks.
sounds good.
Wrap it up. Hey, thanks a lot, guys.
Yeah, thanks. This is great, guys.
all right, cheers, boys.
Have a good one.
Bye.
Yeah,
Bye.
All right.